Lyra Valen walked slowly through the corridors of the Aurora's edge, her footsteps echoing softly against the metal walls. The ship hummed with life, the faint vibration of the engines underlining the constant movement of crew members going about their tasks. Yet despite the bustle, she felt a distinct emptiness, a distance that no amount of activity could bridge. Everywhere she went, she noticed the subtle avoidance of the human crew. The glance that lingered just a moment too long, the conversation that stopped when she entered a room, the empty chair across from her in the mess hall, all reminders that she was different, and that difference made others uncomfortable. Her species, the Valari, were known for their composure, intelligence, and physical grace. But in a ship where humans formed the majority, those traits seemed to mark her as untouchable, unapproachable. She had learned to endure the isolation, to hold her head high while the whispers followed her like shadows. But it weighed on her, a quiet, invisible pressure that pressed down in moments of fatigue. The Nebula mission had brought them far from their usual patrol routes, deep into a sector where few ships ventured. The nebula itself shimmered in the viewport, a swirling mass of colors that seemed alive, pulsing with energy. Lyra had spent hours observing it, studying the unusual electromagnetic fluctuations it emitted. She noted how the energy patterns could potentially interfere with their ship systems. The science intrigued her, but even as she analyzed the data, she could not ignore the sting of solitude. As she settled into her usual corner in the mess hall, she noticed the empty chairs around her. Crew members sat in small groups, chatting, laughing, or quietly eating, but always with a deliberate space between them and her. She wrapped her hands around her tray, her eyes downcast, as if her presence could somehow be hidden. Then, without announcement or hesitation, a chair slid quietly beside her. She looked up, startled, and saw Ethan Cole, the human engineer who rarely spoke more than necessary. He offered no explanation, no smile, no words. He simply sat, his presence steady, calm, and strangely reassuring. Lyra blinked, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to such gestures, this simple act of companionship without expectation. Her instincts, honed over years of navigating a society that valued appearances and status, wanted to search for motive, to question why he was sitting there. But there was nothing in his demeanor to indicate anything beyond simple, quiet presence. For several long moments, they sat in silence, the hum of the ship and the low chatter of the mess hall filling the air. Lyra found herself observing him, noting the slight grease stains on his uniform from his earlier work on the engines, the tired but focused expression on his face, and the way his eyes scanned the room with awareness but without judgment. He wasn't looking at her with curiosity or pity. He was simply there beside her. The small act began to shift something inside her, a warmth she hadn't felt in weeks, maybe months, spread through her chest. She realized that companionship didn't always require words, that understanding could exist quietly, without explanation or ceremony. Over the next few days, this silent routine became a subtle ritual. Ethan continued to sit beside her in the mess hall whenever their schedules overlapped. Sometimes, she caught him during maintenance rounds in the reactor room, quietly observing as she adjusted the monitoring instruments or recorded her observations. His presence was consistent but unobtrusive, a constant that neither sought attention nor forced conversation. The crew soon faced the first challenge of the mission. As the Aurora's edge approached the outer edge of the nebula, the ship's reactor began to show signs of instability. Alarms rang out unexpectedly, the usual routine replaced by a controlled chaos. Lyra rushed to the control room, her hands moving over the consoles, analyzing the incoming data. She noted the sudden spikes in energy and immediately calculated the potential risk to life support and navigation systems. Ethan was already there, crouched near the main reactor interface, his tools in hand. Without speaking, he began to work, adjusting valves, reconnecting circuits, and stabilizing the fluctuating energy. Lyra moved beside him, her hands moving deftly over the diagnostic panels, feeding him corrections, adjusting parameters, and issuing commands to the auxiliary systems. They worked together seamlessly, not because they had discussed it in advance, but because their skills naturally complemented each other. Minutes passed in tense concentration, the hum of the engines interspersed with the occasional beep of a sensor. Lyra found herself noticing not just his efficiency, but the calm determination with which he approached each task. He didn't panic, didn't argue, didn't seek credit. He simply acted, and his actions had weight, precision, and care. The reactor stabilized. A low, steady hum replaced the erratic alarms, and the lights on the control panels returned to their usual glow. Lyra exhaled, a mix of relief and adrenaline coursing through her. She turned to look at Ethan, expecting some comment, some acknowledgement. But he only nodded briefly, eyes focused on the next task, before moving to secure the panels and check the backup systems. In that moment, she understood something profound. Words were not always necessary to convey trust or respect. His silence was not emptiness. It was attention, care, and a quiet acknowledgement of shared responsibility. He had chosen to act without fanfare, without expectation, and in doing so, had given her something she hadn't realized she needed. A sense of partnership, of equal footing, in a universe that often seemed indifferent to her. Later, as the crew gathered in the mess hall for a debrief, Lyra noticed the subtle shift in the room. People who had avoided her glanced her way, some with curiosity, others with the first hints of respect. The story of the reactor incident had spread, and while she had expected some recognition, what mattered more was the quiet presence beside her. Ethan sat in his usual place, silent, unwavering, his presence speaking volumes more than any words could. Lyra found herself drawn to him not by fascination but by relief. Here was someone who saw competence, not species. Here was someone who acted, not judged. Here was someone who offered trust without expectation. She felt a rare smile tug at the corner of her mouth, a gesture small but genuine, and for the first time in weeks, she felt at home aboard the Aurora's edge. The mission continued, but something had changed. Lyra moved through the corridors with less awareness of isolation, her mind less clouded by doubt. She noticed other crew members more keenly, aware that they too were learning slowly, that competence and character mattered more than differences of species. And throughout it all, Ethan remained a quiet presence, not a savior, not a friend in the traditional sense, but a partner in the unspoken language of trust and reliability. As the nebula loomed closer, its vibrant colors casting eerie glows through the ship's viewports, Lyra knew the real test was yet to come. She would need to trust her skills, trust her instincts, and trust the silent engineer who had chosen to sit beside her without a word. In the vast emptiness of space, where survival depended on every hand, every decision, and every mind working together, that quiet companionship might be the difference between life and death. And as she returned to her observation station that night, the nebula stretching endlessly beyond the hull, she realized she was no longer alone. The human engineer beside her had shown her the power of action without words, presence without conditions, and trust without expectation. In that simple, silent act, a new chapter had begun, one that neither of them had announced, but one that neither would ever forget. The nebula stretched ahead of the Aurora's edge like a living canvas of colors, glowing with energy that pulsed and shimmered in waves. Lyra Valen watched it from the observation deck, her eyes scanning the readings on her console while her mind tried to anticipate the unpredictable behavior of the energy currents. She could feel the ship vibrating slightly as it moved closer, the engines working harder to maintain stability. It was beautiful, yes, but dangerous. The nebula was unlike anything recorded in the ship's databases. Ethan Cole moved quietly beside her, a toolkit in hand, as he adjusted the reactor monitoring instruments. He didn't speak. He never did unless necessary. Lyra had grown accustomed to his silence over the past weeks, learning to read the subtle gestures, the small nods, the focused glances that communicated more than words ever could. Today, that silent partnership would be tested. The ship's sensors began to flash with warnings. A spike in the nebula's electromagnetic energy surged toward them, brighter and faster than any pattern they had anticipated. Lyra's heart rate increased, but she focused on the readings, tracing the path of the spike and calculating the potential effects on the ship's systems. The reactor, already under constant load, would not tolerate much more fluctuation. "Ethan," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension, "the energy spike is heading directly for the auxiliary reactor. I need you to stabilize the coolant flow while I reroute the power distribution." He didn't answer with words. He simply moved, adjusting the valves, turning the dials, and running his hands over the conduits with practiced precision. Lyra issued commands to the ship's systems, her fingers dancing over the interface panels as she recalculated every possible outcome. Minutes passed that felt like hours. The alarms rang, echoing through the corridors, and the lights flickered. Crew members rushed past, some yelling over the chaos, some frozen in indecision. But Lyra and Ethan remained focused, a quiet island of concentration amid the storm. A sudden jolt shook the ship, throwing both of them off balance. Lyra grabbed the console to steady herself, while Ethan steadied a conduit that had begun to bend under the stress. Sparks flew, and the hiss of escaping coolant filled the air. "Hold it!" Lyra shouted, almost instinctively. She recalculated the pressure levels, sending a command to open a bypass line. Ethan adjusted the valves, and slowly the pressure stabilized. Sweat ran down his brow, but he made no sound of complaint. As the reactor hummed back to a steady rhythm, Lyra glanced at him. For a brief moment, she noticed the strain on his face, the fatigue in his posture. But there was no hesitation, no doubt. He moved like someone who understood responsibility not as a burden, but as a duty. The rest of the crew slowly realized the danger had passed. The bridge erupted in a mixture of relief and awe as they noticed the quick stabilization of the reactor. Murmurs spread. The alien scientist and the human engineer had worked together flawlessly, without argument, without pause. It was a display of efficiency that silenced the skeptics who had doubted them before. Later, in the mess hall, the atmosphere had changed. Crew members who had once avoided Lyra now looked at her with a new sense of respect. Some even approached, offering small words of congratulations, but she hardly noticed. Her attention was on Ethan, who sat quietly across from her, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't seek praise, didn't ask for recognition. He simply returned to his seat, silent, steady, reliable. Lyra realized that this was more than admiration. It was a lesson in trust. Trust in action, trust in competence, trust in the value of steady presence. Words could not create this. Only consistent effort and unspoken understanding could. The mission pressed on. The nebula's energy fields proved unpredictable, forcing the Aurora's edge into constant adjustments. During one particularly dangerous maneuver, a fragment of ionized gas struck the hull, sending a shockwave through the ship. Lyra and Ethan were in the maintenance bay, monitoring the structural integrity of the engines. The impact triggered an emergency shutdown of several systems. "Engage manual override," Lyra commanded. Ethan's hands moved instantly. He reconnected circuits, reset the flow regulators, and guided the power back into the engines. Lyra recalculated the energy reroutes, issuing precise commands to avoid overloading any other section of the ship. They worked as one, an unspoken rhythm that neither had to announce. During the brief lull when the system stabilized, Lyra allowed herself a moment to breathe. She studied Ethan. He was covered in grime, his uniform marked with streaks of coolant and oil, yet he remained calm, focused, and entirely without complaint. She realized that this was a human trait she hadn't fully appreciated until now, the ability to act in the face of danger without seeking praise or recognition. Their silent teamwork did not go unnoticed. Other crew members began to follow their example, offering help without ego, focusing on solutions instead of blame. The ship's atmosphere shifted subtly. Where isolation and avoidance had once ruled, quiet cooperation and respect started to grow. Lyra felt a sense of hope she hadn't expected to feel aboard the Aurora's edge. One night, after another grueling shift of monitoring and stabilizing the ship systems, Lyra found herself alone on the observation deck, staring at the nebula. The colors were deeper now, richer, almost hypnotic in their movement. She felt exhausted, her mind weary from calculations and decisions. And then, as if he had sensed her fatigue, Ethan appeared beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, shoulder to shoulder, offering silent companionship. Lyra allowed herself to lean slightly against the railing, feeling the comfort of his presence. It was remarkable how much difference a single person could make without saying a word. She realized that companionship was not about constant chatter or recognition. It could be quiet, unassuming, and powerful in its own way. The nebula mission escalated further. A sudden burst of radiation from the core of the nebula struck the ship's shields. Emergency lights flickered, alarms blared, and the hull groaned under the stress. Lyra and Ethan were immediately on the reactor deck, coordinating the stabilization of power flow. The rest of the crew followed orders, but it was their silent communication and mutual understanding that ensured success. Minutes felt like hours as they worked tirelessly. Every calculation, every adjustment, every hand movement mattered. The nebula's unpredictable energy surged around them, threatening systems and lives, yet they remained composed. Finally, with a final adjustment, the reactor hummed smoothly, the alarm ceased, and the ship stabilized. Lyra allowed herself a small smile. She looked at Ethan, who simply nodded, his eyes returning to the systems as if nothing had happened. She realized that this silent partnership had become essential to her survival, to the mission's success, and even to her understanding of herself. Humans, she thought, had a remarkable way of showing strength through action rather than words. As the crew celebrated in the mess hall, Lyra sat quietly, observing the reactions around her. She noticed a change in the way people looked at her, not with fear or distance, but with respect. They had witnessed competence, collaboration, and courage firsthand. And yet she only noticed one presence that mattered most, Ethan, sitting beside her, calm, silent, and unwavering. The mission continued, but Lyra felt a new sense of confidence. She was no longer just an alien scientist aboard a human ship. She was part of a team, part of a silent but powerful bond that transcended words. The nebula might be unpredictable, and the universe might be vast and indifferent, but she had found a connection that made her feel seen, understood, and valued. Ethan didn't need to say anything. His presence spoke for him. And in that presence, Lyra understood the essence of humanity in its finest form: courage, quiet strength, and the ability to stand beside someone without expectation, without judgment, without words. As the Aurora's edge moved deeper into the nebula, Lyra and Ethan prepared for the next challenge, knowing that whatever came, they would face it together, not through conversation, but through shared action, trust, and the unspoken bond that had begun with nothing more than a silent gesture of sitting beside her. And in the endless expanse of space, where dangers waited at every turn, that quiet companionship had become their most powerful tool, a shield stronger than any weapon, a connection that neither time nor distance could break. The Aurora's edge shuddered as the nebula's energy surged violently around it. Lyra Valen gripped the railing of the observation deck, her eyes scanning the chaotic patterns of glowing plasma that twisted and roared like living storms. The ship's systems groaned under the pressure, warning lights flashing red, and the hum of the engines vibrating sharply through the metal hull. The nebula had grown far more unpredictable than any of the ship's instruments could have predicted, and every calculation Lyra made seemed to be immediately challenged by the reality of the storm outside. Ethan Cole appeared silently at her side, tools in hand as if he had always been there. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His presence alone steadied her nerves. She turned to glance at him and saw the same calm determination she had come to rely upon. He had worked tirelessly alongside her through every prior challenge, and now the stakes were higher than ever. A misstep here could mean the destruction of the ship and the lives of everyone aboard. "Ethan, we're going to need to reroute the auxiliary shields directly through the secondary reactors," she said, her voice steady despite the tension. "It will overload the systems temporarily, but it's the only way to stabilize the hull against the plasma surge." He nodded once, already moving to the reactor controls. His hands were steady, precise, moving over the panels and conduits as if guided by instinct rather than thought. Lyra coordinated the calculations, sending commands to the ship's AI to adjust power flow. The two of them moved in perfect harmony, a silent rhythm forged through hours of shared work, their actions complementing each other without a single wasted motion. Suddenly, the ship lurched violently, throwing them both against the control consoles. Sparks flew from the exposed circuits, and alarms blared in a shrill chorus that seemed to shake the very walls. Crew members shouted, scrambling to secure themselves, but Lyra and Ethan were already at work, stabilizing the systems with practiced efficiency. Every adjustment mattered, every calculation had consequences. One mistake could doom them all. Minutes passed in a tense blur. Lyra's mind raced through formulas, probabilities, and energy outputs while her hands moved over the controls with mechanical precision. Ethan worked beside her, his movements deliberate, calm, and exact. He didn't speak, but his presence communicated a profound understanding. They were in this together, and together they could face anything. Finally, with a synchronized effort, they rerouted the power successfully. The plasma surge that had threatened to tear the ship apart calmed, the warning lights returning to a steady green, and the engines hummed once again with controlled strength. Lyra exhaled deeply, her chest rising and falling as adrenaline and relief washed over her. She glanced at Ethan, who simply nodded, brushing grime from his hands without a word. The crew erupted in a mixture of relief and astonishment. They had witnessed an alien scientist and a human engineer saving the ship through silent cooperation and unspoken understanding. For many, it was a revelation. For Lyra, it was a quiet affirmation of something she had already come to know. Actions, more than words, defined character. Days passed as the Aurora's edge continued its journey through the nebula. The energy fluctuations remained unpredictable, each one a test of skill, focus, and teamwork. Lyra and Ethan became the steady center around which the ship's survival depended. They moved through each challenge silently, yet their connection deepened with every coordinated effort. One evening, Lyra was called to the command deck for a briefing. The captain, a seasoned human named Admiral Harris, looked unusually serious. "The nebula is forming unstable energy vortices," he said, gesturing to the holographic display of swirling colors. "We have limited time before one of these vortices strikes us directly. We need precise coordination between the engineering and science teams." "Lyra, Ethan, you two will lead the effort." Lyra's chest tightened, but she felt a surge of determination. She didn't need words to communicate her readiness to Ethan. He simply nodded once, and they moved together toward the reactor and control decks. Their silent communication was enough. They understood each other completely. As the vortex approached, the ship trembled, the lights flickering violently. Lyra issued commands to reroute energy through the secondary shields, while Ethan adjusted the conduits to handle the overload. Crew members moved frantically under their direction, and chaos threatened to overtake order. Yet through it all, Lyra and Ethan remained calm, a steady pair in a storm of uncertainty. A sudden explosion rocked the ship, throwing debris across the control deck. Lyra ducked instinctively, and Ethan shielded a nearby crew member from a falling panel. The vortex struck the hull with a force that could have torn the ship apart, but their preparations held. The shields absorbed the impact, the reactors stabilized, and the ship survived. When the alarms finally ceased, Lyra allowed herself a moment to breathe. Her mind was exhausted, her body tense from the prolonged effort, yet she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. She looked at Ethan, who was quietly checking the systems for secondary damage. His eyes met hers, and she saw the same quiet pride reflected there. They had faced the nebula together, relying not on words, but on trust, competence, and mutual respect. The rest of the crew gathered to assess the aftermath. The captain approached, his expression a mixture of relief and admiration. "You both did exceptionally well," he said. "Without your coordination, the ship would not have survived. I think everyone can learn from how you handled this." Lyra smiled faintly, but her attention remained on Ethan. He gave no response, no boastful words of pride, only a subtle nod before moving to continue his work. That small gesture said more than any speech ever could. In the following days, the mood aboard the Aurora's Edge transformed. Crew members who had once been dismissive or cautious now sought cooperation, inspired by the silent example set by Lyra and Ethan. Trust began to grow among the humans and aliens alike, fostering a culture of mutual respect and teamwork that had been missing before. Lyra found herself reflecting on what had happened. She realized that humanity had a unique quality, an ability to act decisively and compassionately without seeking recognition. Ethan had shown her that words were not always necessary to forge bonds. That silent dedication and consistent presence could create trust and respect that lasted longer than any spoken promise. One night, after a particularly long shift stabilizing the ship systems, Lyra returned to the observation deck alone. The nebula stretched endlessly before her, its colors shifting and pulsing in patterns both chaotic and mesmerizing. She allowed herself a rare moment of peace, taking in the beauty of the cosmos, the quiet hum of the ship, and the knowledge that she was no longer alone. Ethan joined her silently, as he always did. They stood side by side, shoulder to shoulder, watching the nebula together. No words were exchanged, but Lyra felt a profound connection, a sense of shared understanding that transcended species, language, and culture. In the vastness of space, where loneliness was common and danger was constant, they had found trust, companionship, and respect. As the ship moved out of the nebula and back into calmer space, Lyra knew that their bond would endure. It was built not on conversation or recognition, but on action, integrity, and mutual reliance. The silent engineer had shown her the power of quiet strength, and she had learned to value it above all else. The crew celebrated the mission's success, but Lyra and Ethan remained quietly in their corner, observing rather than participating in the festivities. Their work had spoken for itself, and no further acknowledgement was necessary. They had faced the storm together, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, the lessons of the nebula remained with the crew. The ship operated more smoothly, with cooperation replacing hesitation and mutual respect replacing fear of difference. Lyra and Ethan's example had shown the value of humility, competence, and the human ability to connect through action rather than words. And for Lyra, the most important lesson was personal. She had found someone who saw her not as an alien to be avoided, but as a partner, an equal, and a steady presence in the unpredictable expanse of space. Ethan's silence had spoken volumes, teaching her that true companionship did not require words, only trust, understanding, and the willingness to stand beside someone when it mattered most. As the stars stretched endlessly before them, Lyra felt a deep sense of gratitude. Humanity, in its quiet strength and unwavering dedication, had reminded her that even in the coldest and most distant corners of the universe, connection and trust could thrive. And as long as she and Ethan faced the cosmos together, she knew they could endure anything. In the end, it was not heroics, speeches, or accolades that mattered. It was presence, action, and trust. And in the vast emptiness of space, Lyra Valen had found both, sitting silently beside the human engineer who had changed everything without ever speaking a word.